This is Future Talk.
Future Talk.
Future Talk with Omnia Al Saleh and Hani Balkis.
Welcome back to Future Talk right here on Pulse 95. It is me, Hani Balkis, with Omnia Sar, bringing you everything you need to know about what's happening in the tech world and around the world. Now, today we're going to be talking about NASA. We're talking about space, ladies and gentlemen, and how joining the NASA's Artemis Accords will help the UAE send the first Emirati to the moon.
Yes, indeed. So the moon is now our new goal since we already have launched the Hope probe all the way to Mars. But coming up on Future Talk as well, we're talking about the world's first face scan plan that has been sparking lots and lots of privacy fears. And this is all happening in Singapore. But who knows? It may become a reality right here in the UAE as well.
Yes, a lot of people are kind of scared about showing their face and people knowing who they are by their face, which is ironic because you know people by their face. But we're also going to be talking about 3D printing today, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, indeed. And not just any form of 3D printing, but 3D printing for kids. And this is definitely going to be a very interesting conversation with Ruba Hassan, who's going to be telling us all about her startup 3D Enova that has been created and started right here in Sharjah. So she was actually holding a lot of workshops to teach kids about 3D printing, the basics of it. But since COVID-19, since the COVID-19 pandemic has started, she's been doing that in a very interesting way by sending out a 3D printer for parents and kids to experiment with it. But what are the benefits of 3D printing and how can they help children become a lot more creative? This is definitely going to be a very interesting discussion today.
Yes, indeed. We're very excited. We've seen 3D printing kind of the explosion of 3D printing ever since the COVID-19 pandemic. Very excited to get into that. We're going to be taking a short break, but when we come back, we're talking about space, ladies and gentlemen.
Daily digital news. Bits and bytes connect our world.
Your quick roundup of everything that is happening in the tech world in the UAE and around the world. Today, we're talking all about UAE in space because recently the UAE signed the NASA's Artemis Accords to help send the first Emirati to the moon. And this is a great accomplishment because the UAE has actually become a founding member of the US-led Artemis Accords so that we can help explore space without necessarily harming the environment.
Yes, indeed. Now, with the joining of the Artemis Accords, it does, just like you said, it paves a peaceful way for sending the first Emirati to the moon in the future. Now, just last week, the Emirates and 6 other nations did sign on to become founding members of the US-led Accords, which do outline the responsible and peaceful moon exploration. Now, Omni and I have talked a couple months ago about how there's actually a problem with pollution in space and how there's satellites that
space debris,
and there's satellites that roam around and orbit the space that are no longer in use. But the long-term plan is to build a lunar orbiting space station, which will be called the Lunar Gateway and will be used as the moon as a base. So the first astronauts can go to Mars from there. And Oni and I actually we did foreshadow this. We foreseen this, that one day that the moon will be kind of like a docking station and they'll continue their route to the moon or to Mars or whatever planet we do go on.
Yes, indeed. And we actually we're looking at it just like the International Space Station is currently like a docking station for other explorations. The moon will hopefully become a base as well.
Yes. I mean, did you know, by the way, I think a couple of days ago, the International Space Station did go through a problem?
No way.
I think there was an oxygen depletion problem.
Oh, yes, I've heard it.
Yeah, and I was going crazy. I was like, I was supposed to send you the message, Omnia, but I forgot to. But I mean, the UAE has not signed an agreement yet to be part of the Artemis program, but the Accords have laid the foundation for any future collaboration, which does mean that once human space flights to the moon do become regular, Emirati astronauts will likely have opportunities to be a part of them. Now, I just love the fact that the UAE is looking towards space, looking towards going to the moon and going to the Mars. And we've been doing a lot of things as the UAE. And it just reminds me of the picture, Omnia. I think the picture was around in the 1970s with Sheikh Zayed, rest in peace. He was there, and I think they're looking at a spaceship.
Yes, and he was actually already foreshadowing that the UAE will be a part of the space race.
And some years later, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed and Hazal Mansour and Sultan Niya, they were doing the same thing, looking at these spaceships for future space exploration. I'm super excited to see what happens next.
I'm very excited as well because through the Artemis program, we're looking at the UAE sending out the first woman and the next man to the lunar surface by the year 2024, which actually sounds a lot closer than we think. Now,
3 years.
I know. And thinking about it, I mean, just last year, we sent out the first Emirati astronaut to the International Space Station. So just a couple of years later, we are looking to go to the moon. Now, the moon is definitely the horizon in terms of a mission that is approaching going to other planets as well and exploring different homes apart from planet Earth. But the Artemis Accords is also going to be looking at other partnerships with different countries. So it's basically going to be a huge space race. I think about 8 countries will be involved, including the UAE.
And by the way, Omna, did you know that Emirati engineers at the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center are actually building the rover and have shortlisted 5 possible landing locations on the near side of the moon. Now, lately, I do believe that most of it was being built, I think, in Japan or Russia.
Yeah.
I think.
No, they were built here, but they're launching.
They're being launched in
from
Japan and Russia. So seeing it being built right here in the UAE is amazing. And it just comes as the future Space Force, the future Space Academy. And the UAE being part of it, as someone who lives in the UAE, who lives in Sharjah his whole life, I'm proud, I'm excited, and maybe I can go to the moon.
Well, I hope that you can go to the moon, but you can't leave Future Talk over here back on Earth. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Singapore, because it's definitely news that is scaring a lot of people, and it has to do with our faces being scanned.
Very controversial, Omnia. Now, Singapore's world's first face scan does spark a lot of privacy fears. But before we get into that, Omnia, let's talk about your Face ID that you use on your phone.
Yeah.
Now, we all have Face ID enabled.
We use it every day.
We use it every day. So, and Apple, which is a private company, does have those files, or they have the files that are stored. So, why are we scared from a government who can be held accountable? Obviously, Apple can be held accountable as well. But a government who can be held accountable, why are we scared of that? But Singapore will become the world's first country to use facial verification in its national ID scheme. But privacy advocates are alarmed by what they say is an intrusive system and is vulnerable to abuse, which I don't agree with.
I agree with you as well. I mean, the way we're looking at it is what's different with this scenario is these face IDs are not going to be owned by a company, but rather owned by the government. And Singapore's rollout is going to be one of the first countries to attach your facial verification, your face scan, to a national identification database. So it's basically going to be your ID in your face, which I personally think is going to be much faster.
Much faster, more
to
convenient.
Get things done.
Example, Omnia, there's let's say this is being used right here, or let's say in the US.
I mean, we see it in the UAE. Whenever you're coming back or even traveling, you can basically use your face to move around.
Now, Gulf nationals only need to travel to other Gulf countries. They don't need their passport.
True.
All they do is they need their ID, their Emirates ID or whatever ID they use. So imagine you board on a plane, you don't need your ID anymore. All
Just
you need
your
is
face.
no more. Oh, I forgot my passport. I forgot my Emirates ID. I forgot whatever. All you need is your face, and that is your passport to the world. I'm with it. I like it.
I love it. I feel like it sounds like a dream come true, but a lot of people have definitely been worried about privacy issues and privacy concerns with it, especially because it's already been deployed in a lot of government offices right now in Singapore. But the facial verification, honestly, I mean, we've come to a time in our lives where it's being implemented everywhere in your phone. So if Apple owns it, so why not have governments own it as well?
I mean, even I believe towards 2008 and toward 2009, airports right here in the UAE were doing retinal scans.
And your thumb scans whenever you're going in.
Exactly. I mean, who cares about... I mean, it's not a big deal, but some people... I mean, for me, I don't believe it's a big deal. I don't feel like it's a threat to your identity because... I mean, there's so many pros against the cons.
I agree. And I feel like it's much safer than, let's say, remembering a password or having,
of course.
Any other form of authentication. But for those who are worried about, let's say, any abuse happening to these files, I mean, I think we're worried about a scenario to happen as what happened in China. So with the whole like surveillance and your biometrics being used against you.
I mean, the only way it'd be used against you is if you break the law.
True.
So what I like to go by is obey the law, and you're safe to go. All you have to do is obey the law. But it's people who want to break the law. I mean, that's a different story. Let us know your guys' thoughts. 4215 Durat Salat. Number one, are you fine with your ID, your facial recognition, being used as your ID, instead of your ID, or are you scared that it might be abused? 4215 Durat Salat, or on our Instagram at Pulse95 Radio. But coming up, we're talking with who?
We're going to be talking with Ruba Hassan, who's going to be telling us all about 3D printing and the benefits it could bring for children and students in the UAE and around the world. Keep Pulse 95 locked. We'll be right back.
Check this out. Check this out. Pulse 95.
3D printing is a technology that scientists and engineers are using to change the world. But what if we could put that piece of technology into the hands of students and children, turning them from students into creators? 3D printing technology has definitely helped many students inspire their creativity and get them to think a little bit outside the box. So instead of buying creations and the games of other content creators, they can become inventors themselves, creating solutions to solve their very own problem. Joining us today is Ruba Hassan, the founder of the startup 3D Enova right here in Sharjah, that holds workshops to teach children and university students on the basics of 3D printing and how to use 3D printers. Welcome to the show, Ruba.
Welcome, Omnia. Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. The pleasure is all ours. Now, Ruba, let's kickstart this conversation by asking you, what is 3D printing and what does the 3D printing process look like?
So 3D printing is the process of creating three-dimensional objects. So how a 3D printer, a basic FDM 3D printer works is by melting plastic and creating the final 3D object by creating layers. Just like you would layer a cake, for example, you would create one layer at a time until you have a final three-dimensional object.
Now, it's definitely interesting to hear children become interested in 3D printing, but it does offer a lot of career options for them whenever they grow up. But many parents can still be a little bit, weary of it. It's still a mysterious subject for them. So in your opinion, is it easy for children to learn 3D printing and at what age can we start introducing them to this field?
So with regards to 3D printing, by using actual 3D printers, we start with the age of 12 years plus. The reason is because before any kid needs to learn how to 3D print, they need to learn how to 3D design first. 3D designing is the most important part before we 3D print, because if a person is not able to create, or a child is not able to create their own three-dimensional objects, they won't be able to 3D print them. So this is the first step. And using any CAD or design software, the child needs to be above 12 years old. This is the ideal age. Before the age of 12, we use something different, which is called 3D pens. So the 3D pens is an easier freehand kind of tool that kids can use to learn what 3D printing or what three-dimensional objects is all about.
Now, in your opinion, how does this boost creativity for the child or even for university students?
So they always tell us in school, the best way to learn is by making and seeing things, correct?
Yeah.
So 3D printing helps students see things. For example, the Earth layers. So you want to learn all about the Earth layers. Instead of learning about it from a textbook, you can create a three-dimensional object of the Earth layers. Usually when we create those projects, the Earth layers, for example, we create it out of cardboard. But these days, you can create a digital file, 3D print it, and understand all the different aspects of the Earth layers, but in a digital way and 3D printed.
Amazing. Now I want to talk about something. Now, we always hear the older generation say this younger generation isn't as creative because they have games, they have social media, etc. Now, I like the fact that we're kind of jumping in and using our technology to be creative, and 3D printing is an amazing technology.
I mean, we've definitely seen it come to life, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, we've seen different companies shift their entire manufacturing to help create and use 3D printing to create face masks, ventilator applicators. So a question that comes to mind, how long does a child take to learn the basics of 3D printing? What is the timeline for it?
So it depends on the age, but usually from around 12 to 15 years, it will take around 4 to 6 sessions. Where each session is around 45 to 1 hour long. In these 6 sessions, we cover the design aspect as well as we cover the basic 3D printing aspect.
So it's not a big timeline at all. I feel like by the sixth session, they'll be able to create their very own, at least miniature 3D printed design.
Yes, because I mean, kids these days are they're way better than the older generation with technology and using iPads and computers. So it will be much easier for them to understand the concept really, really fast.
Now, how costly is it for someone to get their hands on a 3D printer?
So a 3D printer starts with around, let's say, 700 dirhams.
Okay.
And then it will go up to 10,000 dirhams, depending on the specifications.
Sounds reasonable. 700 dirhams is obviously you're getting a basic entry level 3D printer, but it should cater the children and university students' needs.
Absolutely. Coming up on Future Talk, we're going to be talking all about how 3D printing may just not be for every child. So how do you know if it is something that would interest your child, as well as when should a parent know how and when to give up? This is all going to be coming up in just a few moments. If you have any questions for Ruba Hassan, make sure you share them with us at Pulse 95 Radio on Instagram, and our text lines are open for 215 do or ittisalat. Keep Pulse 95 locked. We'll be right back.
Check this out. Check this out. Pulse 95.
Teach them young is what we say, and this is definitely also applicable when it comes to different tech skills, because the more kids engage with technology at a younger age, the more proficient they will be at it whenever they enter the workforce. And this is exactly going to be the discussion of today as we talk about 3D printing for kids. It's a technology that could help turn students into innovators and much more creative human beings. And this is what we need in today's day and age. Gone are the days when people can just be book smart. Joining us today is Ruba Hassan, the founder of the startup 3D Enova right here in Sharjah, that holds different workshops to teach children and university students on 3D printing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ruba. And a question comes to mind whenever we're talking about 3D printing and parents encouraging their children to enter 3D printing. When should a parent consider allowing their child or encouraging their children to enter 3D printing? And when should they know it's time to give up? Because we find this, evident with sports. A lot of parents will encourage their children, you should get into football, you should get into basketball, but maybe the child is just not into sports. So is the same true when it comes to teaching children 3D printing?
Yes, definitely, Omnia. So the thing is with 3D printing, like I said, you need to first be able to learn the art of 3D design. So with 3D designing, 3D printing, patience is the most important part of learning this technology, because you need time. And just like not only learning how to 3D design, it takes some time, but also 3D waiting for an object to 3D print takes a lot of time. So kids who are patient, who enjoy arts and crafts, who enjoy sitting doing arts for a very long time are ideal kids who would be interested for 3D printing. Now, if a child is really active and wants to jump around and run around all the time, so probably not the ideal student, because we did have some students who was not able to sit for more than 6, 7, 8 minutes, and he would start,
Fidgeting
I'm bored. Yeah, I'm bored. This is boring. I can't do it. It needs patience. Really, it needs a lot of patience. So ideal students would be, or kids would be, those who enjoy arts.
Yes.
That's Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you a question now. Do you believe that any student or any child that wants to become, for example, an engineer or mechanical engineer or any type of engineer, do they need a background on 3D printing? Will 3D printing be an essential tool for these type of job professions?
So it does help to be an engineer or in architecture. It does really help because there are basics in 3D design that you learn in your engineering degree. So that does help a lot. But you don't really need to be an engineer or an architect to be able to learn how to 3D print. There are now really, really basic design tools where you can 3D design anything in less than 30 minutes and 3D print it. So you don't really need that background, but it does help a lot to create more complex parts.
Oftentimes, whenever something new and shiny comes along, especially in the field of technology, people rush to it and, they immediately want to implement it. As we mentioned, kids would want to try it out, but no one really ever stops to think about the why. So can you tell us a little bit about the different applications for 3D printing that would help a student implement it in real life? So if a child has the skill to 3D print, how could that come in handy in their day-to-day life?
So one way that 3D printing is really important is, for example, for university students and their senior design projects. So, for example, looking at architecture students, they create really complex, let's say, interior design products that are really complex shapes. And, for example, making that product out of wood would waste a lot of material, and they might not get the first shape immediately. But with 3D printing, they can 3D design that product, keep changing it until they have the final real product, and then 3D print it, and they would get the product from the first time. So that's why 3D printing is not everything can be 3D printed. For example, you want to create a shelf for your TV, for example. Ideally, you would make that out of wood, not 3D printed, because that will waste a lot of plastic material that you don't really need, and it will take a lot of time. And you can create it out of wood with half of the time, and it will be 10 times more expensive than wood.
How long? Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say 3D printing is mainly for products that are complex and not easy to make out of traditional material.
How long does it take for a certain item to be 3D printed, and how does the time vary from one item to the other?
So let's say if you want to make a USB cover, for example, you have a small USB stick and you want to make a nice fancy cover for it. So that would take around 35 minutes to make it.
And I've seen a lot of people use 3D printing for engraving phone covers.
Yes, that's correct.
So I believe that it does make the child or any person who does want to use 3D printing kind of explore their imagination a little bit more, because as long as they have that essential tool that they are open to anything, they can basically create anything they want or anything their mind does see that is viable to be created. So I like that a lot. Now the question I want to ask is, in your opinion, what age should we tackle and teach the child 3D printing? What age do you think is the most appropriate?
The most appropriate age would be around 12 years old. There are 11-year-olds and 10-year-olds who are, tech savvy, and they would be interested in this immediately. But I would say the average would be around 12 years old.
So every 12-year-old could actually potentially start the process of learning how to 3D print. And the reason behind it is definitely the design aspect as well. Whenever we're talking about 3D printing, safety is a big concern, especially for parents whenever they're going to want to embark on the journey of teaching their children how to use a 3D printer. So what are some of the precautions that parents should keep in mind whenever they are teaching their child how to use a 3D printer?
Generally speaking, 3D printers are safe. But in terms of safety, because a 3D printer melts plastic, there's a part of the 3D printer that's called a nozzle. This nozzle heats up to more than 200 degrees. So if accidentally someone touches that nozzle from the bottom, or they want to see what's there or why the plastic's coming out of there, they might burn their fingers. That's one. So that's one precautionary thing that they should look out for. The other is if you're a beginner with 3D printing, I don't advise leaving the 3D printer running on its own without supervision just at the beginning, because sometimes it might fail halfway through a print, and that's very, very often with 3D printers, they fail. So it's not advised to leave the 3D printer unsupervised just at the beginning. After that, you can leave it running overnight, and that should be fine once you are used to using the printer.
So these are just a few precautionary measures that parents and children can keep in mind. Coming up on Future Talk, we're going to be talking about Ruba's own journey with 3D printing, how she fell in love with it, but also what can you do if you don't want to spend a lot of money to buy a 3D printer, but you just want to experiment if a child would be interested in this form of tech. If you have any questions for Ruba Hassan, make sure you send them in at 4215 do Itisalat or slide into our DMs at Pulse 95 Radio.
Yes, we're going to be taking a short break, but we're going to be back really, really quick.
Pulse 95.
Apps all around.
What's worth a click and download?
3D printing can turn any student into a creator, and instead of going ahead and consuming content from other creators and buying games, they can go ahead and become inventors that can fulfill their very own needs. But with every new piece of tech, there's always a lot of questions and mysteries about this brand new field. And this is exactly why today we are joined by Ruba Hassan, who's going to be telling us a little bit more about the benefits of 3D printing, as well as her own story with 3D printing. She started her startup 3D Enova with Shira right here in Sharjah, and she has been holding different workshops, sending out 3D printers to the homes of many parents and children so that they can also embark on this journey at their own pace. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ruba. A question that comes to mind, since you also are basically a self-taught 3D printing specialist, can you share with us how did you first fall in love with 3D printing?
Before I started 3D Enova, I was a full-time structural and design engineer, and I was working in a manufacturing company for 7 years. So during my my career, I discovered 3D printing at my company, and I thought it was a really amazing tool to use. We started making all kinds of phone covers, lighter caps, and so on with the 3D printer. So at that time, I was also pregnant with my second child, and I thought it was an interesting tool, you know. So I told my husband, you know, this is such a cool tool to use, and I think this is the future. So he said, you know, since you love 3D printing so much, and you're an expert at 3D design as well, because of my job, why don't you start teaching kids about 3D printing? So that's when I said, okay, let's do this, you know?
Now I want to ask you a question. Did your background of, because you're a civil engineer, did your background in civil engineering help you kind of get into 3D printing more, or 3D modeling in general?
It did help me a little bit with the design, but sadly it did not help me much. Because when I graduated from civil engineering, I completely shifted to mechanical engineering field. So I didn't really use my civil engineering degree much. I shifted completely to mechanical engineering. I did have some design background, but because of the work experience that I got from the industry, I managed to start my own business.
And this goes to show that you don't necessarily need to major in engineering or even design for you to get into 3D printing. As you mentioned, any child from the age of 12 can go ahead and explore what this field has to offer. Right here in Sharjah, Ruba, you've been doing a very interesting form of teaching 3D printing. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes. So when the lockdown happened, before the lockdown, we were running a lot of training programs, a lot of workshops. And but when COVID-19 and the lockdown happened, we weren't able to run any events or any training programs. So we thought, okay, so if we can't get the students to us, we will get the 3D printers to them. So we set up a home 3D printing program, we call it, where we give students access to our online e-learning platform that has all kinds of 3D design and 3D printing lessons that they can stream online on our website, as well as we deliver to their doorstep a 3D printer with 5 rolls of 3D printing material for them to self-learn 3D design through our website and try and 3D print their products for 1 whole week.
I love this.
Amazing. For like a free trial.
Literally, and you don't even have to spend money on the 3D printer and, risk your child not falling in love with it. You can try it out for a week. If they're interested, they can go ahead and consider different options.
And for the program, I know there's a program on the computer that is needed. Is it easy to use these type of programs? Like anyone can use it, or it needs a thorough course on how to use them?
As a beginner, it does need a course to use it. That's why we have the self-learning tools on our website. But it is easy to use by so many people once you understand the concept of 2D and 3D objects. So once you really understand, dimensions, 2D, 3D objects and dimensioning, and imagining what your final product will look like, it will become much easier.
Amazing.
Ruba Hassan, thank you so much for joining us today and enlightening us about the world of 3D printing and how every student could go ahead and become a part of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
You.
Thank you so much.
Catch us again later, same time tomorrow from 2 to 3 p.m. only here on Future Talk
on Pulse 95.
If you liked this episode of Future Talk, drop a like and subscribe.
Pulse 95.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram for all our daily updates and top stories.